Hello everyone. Hello, very good afternoon to all of you and welcome to the Legacy IAS. My name is Abhishek Singh, and guys, I hope that all of you have seen and attended the UPSC Mains GS1 question paper. So I'm going to have an analysis and discussion of the history and culture portion, even though there are certain questions which may not be categorized properly either in history or in culture, or they are like a combination of history and a society, both. However, I have included some questions that will be discussed in this session, that is under the part of the history and culture. So let us start the discussion right straightforward. And first of all, before going directly to the questions, guys, let me tell you that this time, the UPSC actually gave some surprises also to the students, as it asked the questions also from the world history. And not just that, it asked the questions on a little bit different ground, like you have seen the question of the you can say on the tribal knowledge system, or the question related to the contribution of the women specifically in the gig economy and all that. So that is actually what it makes the question paper a little bit not so conventional in many aspects, and in many aspects for other questions you can easily go through the previous year questions and you can see that certain questions are still getting repeated off. Okay, so guys, before we could start further, so let me tell you that if this is visible to all of you. All right, so let us see the first question. What does it say? And we will not actually discuss in very elaborate manner, but we will just give you an idea that how to attempt this question, how to solve this question for the 10 marks in 150 words. Okay, so first question is the evaluate the nature of Bhakti literature and its contribution to the Indian culture. All right, so guys, as we all know that Bhakti literature, right, that can be categorized as whatever literature that was provided by the Bhakti movement saints. Okay, by the Bhakti movement saints. So as we all know that we can categorize the Bhakti movement in the various categories, like in the beginning part we can categorize the Bhakti movement as the Alvars and the Nayanars. Okay, that is the Vaishnavites and the Shaivites. Okay, and further, if we are coming laterwards, so we can categorize the Bhakti movement of the northern India and in the Deccan, right, that is the Maharashtra Dharma. So guys, it is not you have to write, this is not something that you have to write. I'm just telling you that these are the things how to approach the question. Okay, so in northern India, if suppose you consider, so you get the Sagun and you get Nirgun. Here you get in Deccan you get Varkari and Dharkari. Now coming to the question, right, so this is about the Bhakti movement, and definitely the Bhakti poets and saints, definitely they have written certain books and certain creations. Like if we go to the creations of Ramanuja, right, Ramanujacharya, or if we go to the creations of the Kabir, or creations of the Nanak, or even the creations related to the Alvars and the Nayanars. All right, so we do not have to name those books, we do not have to name these saints here. We have to evaluate the nature of Bhakti literature and its contribution. Understand the question here, right? So nature of Bhakti literature. Okay, nature of Bhakti literature, it is essentially the same thing as we know the nature of Bhakti movement, that it was based on devotional ideas. Okay, first, nature based on devotional ideas. Second, usually emphasized on the folk languages या folk है ना, folks languages. All right. Again, you can see the another nature. You can write down that critical of social discrimination, right? Discrimination. All right. And another nature you can write down, like 3 natures you have written. The 4th nature you can write down that it provided a sense of refuge to the deprived and exploited people. ठीक है ना? So that is how it goes, that so you have to actually write down only the basic nature of the literature. Now if it depends, like it has the 150 word limit, so you can like give an explanation of 1 or 2 line, not more than that. That is all. Okay. And since there are 2 things asked in the questions, like one is the nature and another is the contribution to the Indian culture. Okay. So if we come to the contribution to the Indian culture, so now we do not have to write it down from the social aspect. We have to write it down from the cultural aspect. Okay. So contribution to Indian culture. All right. Contribution to Indian culture. So you can say that gave rise to new form of poetry, right? New form of poetry. Got it? For example, the devotional poetry, it was not there. It came only due to the Bhakti movement. And second, the contribution to the Indian culture, that it carried and transferred the legacy of, right? The legacy of Indian ethos. That means whatever things we call it as the Indian culture, the kindness, the pity, the mercy, the compassion for the poor, that all actually came into the Indian culture mainly due to the Bhakti literature. Then made the rise of, or led to the, you can also write it, led to the rise of regional tongues as language of literature. For example, you can say that before Bhakti movement there was no literary use. You can simply write to the example also. There was no literary use of the Braj Bhasha, right? There was no literary use of the Maithili, right? There was no literary use of the Marathis, right? Even though you say that Gatha Satsai, that was written in the Maharashtri Prakrit, but Maharashtri Prakrit was essentially not Marathi. In fact, you can give the entire credit to the Bhakti literature, right? You can in fact write it down as a separate point itself, that it diversified the linguistic composition of the entire Indian subcontinent. Not just that, but even in the Bangla, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, okay, Asamiya Shankardev, all right, and in the Kannada there was Basavanna, okay, in the Gujarati there was a Narsingh Mehta, okay, Dadu Dayal in the Rajasthani, Mirabai in the Rajasthani, Surdas in the Braj Bhasha. So the regional linguistic composition of India became highly diversified, and all these languages actually attained the status of the literary languages because of the Bhakti literature. That is what you can write down in the answer, and trust me, you are going to get good marks into that. Okay, coming to the next question, that is the trace the rise and growth of the socio-religious reform movements with special reference to the Young Bengal and Brahmo Samaj. Got it? So understand the question first. Rise and growth of socio-religious reform movements with special reference to Young Bengal and Brahmo Samaj. That means you have to give a general start to the question, right? You have to give to the question a general start, and like start mention, right? Keep mentioning the features or the rise and growth okay, the factors behind it, okay, all that in the first half of the answer. All right, first half of the answer. And in the second half, what do you have to do? Like the first half is to be smaller and the second half is to be a little bit longer. Like if 150 words, so kindly write down like 50 words somehow in the first half, and the second half, that should be given 100 words space, because it is asking you Young Bengal and Brahmo Samaj, reference of that. And in light of these, you have also to trace the rise and growth of socio-religious reform movements. Okay, and as we all know that the Young Bengal movement did not succeed much, so that is where you have also to keep in the attention, you have also keep in focus the lack of popularity that was prevalent during the earlier periods of the socio-religious reform movements. Okay, so let us see how to develop this answer. We have to write a general beginning that the emergence of, right, the emergence of reactions in the, by the educated middle classes to the prevalent social or the socio-religious, you can write down, okay, both are correct, socio-religious conditions of the 19th century India, okay, led to the rise of a spring of reforms called as socio-religious reforms. I told you to keep it limited to the 50 words only. So you can say like the major contributing factors, right? Major contributing factors, like first of all, you can say the impact of or the influence of the Western education. Okay, Western education. Second, the rise of intellectual classes. Third, that is the increased awareness of society and recognition of the inherent social drawbacks, right? So you can simply write down like these are the contributing features. You can write down either these four or simply write down about 2 lines that mainly due to the impact of the Western education, the middle classes started to witness the inherent drawbacks of Indian society and they started to strive for the reforms in the Indian society. All right. And then after that, once you have done that part, so that is 50 words or the 60 words, that is completed the first half. And the second half, that is asking you to represent the major reference of the Brahmo Samaj and Brahmo Samaj and Young Bengal movement. All right, Young Bengal movement. So there you do not have to unnecessarily write that Brahmo Samaj was founded by this fellow and had this particular way of working, and Young Bengal was founded by this fellow. Like you just have to write down that Brahmo Samaj as an organization, Brahmo Samaj or as a Young Bengal as an organization were founded by the most illuminous or the most illuminary personalities of the contemporary age, namely Raja Ram Mohan Roy and Henry Vivian Desrosiers respectively. All right, and these represented the earliest rise of the socio cultural or socio-religious understanding of the drawbacks among the educated intelligentsia, right? These had following you can say affirmative or positive points or following features, and there you have to write down that it was very much, right, inclusive, right, inclusive, progressive, and revolutionary. And here revolutionary does not mean, okay, right, does not mean that it was going to cause some sort of unrest, right? Revolutionary is only applicable to the young Bengal because they wanted these changes to be hurried. Okay, revolutionary only for young Bengal. And Brahmo Samaj was reformative. Okay, you can say that next point you can write down the features that Brahmo Samaj was only reformative, not revolutionary. Only reformative, not revolutionary. Another feature you can write down, considered the social reforms as the backbone of nation building. In fact, let me tell you that Henry Thoreau, he is also regarded as the earliest nationalist poet in India. Okay, so this is the question that can be very easily solved from the old NCERT of class 12th modern history written by Bipin Chandra, and even in the spectrum also it is given very clearly. So this is how you have to write. Then after that you have to proceed, and you have to write certain limitations, that these were ahead of the time, not very popular, concentrated in the urban areas, and restricted to the minuscule percentage of population. Hardly 1 or 2% of the people were literate, and that is why it was very, very non-influential amongst the mass of the country. Okay, so these all things you will write, and the question will be answered completely. Next question is that assess the main administrative issues and the socio-cultural problems in the integration process of the Indian princely states. As we all know, that question demands the introduction of general kind. Like, these questions are not asking for the specific introductions, just introduce like in 2 or 3 lines and then go ahead to write down your answer, because you do not have the much words. You have just 150 words. You have to mention the administrative issues, socio-cultural problems in the integration process. So just mention the general introduction of, right? Then there are 2 major things to be answered here: administrative issues, okay, administrative issues, and second thing is that, right, that is you have to answer the cultural problems also. For the first time I am seeing that the cultural problems were also inconsistent, because in cultural problem what is to be written, that is the main thing. Okay, so in introduction, how will you present it? Very simple, that simply write it down, give a common introduction that under the Mountbatten Plan, okay, under the Mountbatten Plan, in bracket, Indian Independence Act 1947. You can use these abbreviations, do not worry. Okay, 1947, the princely states, right, the princely states were given the choice of joining either India or Pakistan, or to stay independent. Now see how to connect this introduction with the main body of your answer. That is the key, that is the trick actually, that makes your answer look very beautiful and look very presentable. You have to just mention it very simple, that however following administrative and cultural issues, right? Cultural issues led to several problems in their integration, right? Integration. Got it? So here first put the heading administrative issues. All right, and I'm just putting it on the other side. You can put it in the vertical line only, because I'm just doing it because of the space I have got the. Okay, so that is why. So administrative issues, and then you have to put the you can say cultural issues, right? Cultural issues. So they had the administrative issues and cultural issues also, right? That means administrative problems were coming and cultural problems were coming. What were the problems, by the way? Administrative. The question of principality. That means who will be the sovereign or who will not be the sovereign, or who will be the head of that area that was merging into India. Guys, I'm just telling you the points. You can actually write down the 2-line or 1-line explanation also if it demands, if it actually gives the time. Otherwise, do not write down. Okay. Then question of principality was there. Then question of treatment met to royal princess. Okay. Then demands of special perks. A lot of princesses used to demand unusual things. Okay. Then technical problems of merger, right? Technical problems of merger, that means what? Like what should be the conditions, okay? What should be the prices, or what should be the you can say position in the constitution, and how should it be, right? How should and when should it be carried, right? When should it be carried? So all these things were administrative issues. Like some states were not ready to give the executive power, some were not ready to give the judicial power, some were asking that their princes or their kings should be made the head of the state permanently, their successors should be made permanently heads, or if not though, so they should be given some specific treatment. So all these type of administrative issues were coming, and cultural issues were also there. For example, the disconnected royal and administrative practices. Okay. Then lack of people to people interaction. Then certain states also had the religious and regional differentiations, or the differences with most of the country. Then cultural reservations about language. Okay, especially the question that which language shall be the national language. Like even in Pakistan also the problem was there, but in India also it was bigger problem. Like states were asking that we should be like continuing to work in our own language, and we should not be able to accept we should not be going to accept any other language imposed upon us by the Indian state. So guys, especially the northeastern princely states, or any princely states in fact in any part of India, especially the parts which were quite remote, they created a lot of troubles in cultural aspects also. Okay, so about the language, about the customs and ethos, right? Customs and rituals, you can say, or traditions. Okay, so these things you have to mention under the particular question. Now Coming to the next question, examine the uniqueness of tribal knowledge system when compared with the mainstream knowledge and cultural systems. Guys, this was probably or perhaps the most unique question asked, even though the experts and several experts apart from like there are other people also who are saying that this question should fall under the society, that Indian society part, but I have included it under the cultural part, cultural history, rather than the society or anything else, because what happened that this is actually this question is the amalgamation of society, okay, culture, science, environment, and so many things. Okay, so basically this is a very unique question that actually puts you on the thinking mode, that as an aspirant or as a future officer, how should be your thinking or how should be your opinion related to something very interesting, very curious, and very in the news. Now let me tell you that this was actually based on a report of The Hindu that was published in the month of November 2018. Now it's very surprising that anybody preparing for 2021 mains examination will be reading or going through the November 2018 article of The Hindu. I don't think so, but if like one had gone through, or recently this was also in the news because the government actually was trying to bring a bill with that would be protecting the tribal practices and the tribal languages, the tribal knowledge. So maybe because of that this question was asked. Okay, in the global level also you can see the several efforts, right, especially for the knowledge of the indigenous people. In fact, let me tell you that very recently there was a news that Tata Institute of Fundamental Research, it has got some fundings, etc. It is getting some fundings, etc. to conduct a study on what? To conduct a study on the tribal astronomy, right? Tribal astronomical practices, that how do they actually consider the study of astronomy by relative positions of the stars, and how do they actually predict the you can say forecast of weather and the seasonal changes and so many things very accurately. Okay, so we can say that our tribal knowledge system has got a lot of uniqueness in the in the knowledge as far as the accumulation or storage of the knowledge is concerned, as compared to the mainstream knowledge and mainstream culture. Got it now? So what is the approach that we have to take? We just have to take a very brief approach because it is just a 10 marker, 150 words. So you just have to keep an introduction, and this is actually a specific introduction that is required to be given. I will tell you how, and then you just have to put like a few points, like I will say 4-5 points with illustrations or with examples rather, right, with examples, so that your point is proven, and do not expect that you will get like 100% perfect thing in that. But now coming to the point here, right, if we see that what exactly goes like. So guys, you just have to start, right, that in this way. For example, that the traditional way of living under the minimum resources, right, minimum resources have made the exceptional skill of tribals to sustain due to their unique knowledge of their premises in general and the cohabitants, right, cohabitants like plants, animals, and their behavioral, right, their behavioral understandings in particular. ठीक. So that is how you have to approach the specific introduction here. And you can say, for example, you can give the example also that will be able to connect. Okay, example, the contribution or the knowledge system of Toda tribes of Nilgiris, or the Baiga tribes of Madhya Pradesh, or even several tribes of Western Ghats who are aware of various unique methods which are much more efficient and sustainable, in the study, protection and conservation of flora and fauna, and the details connected to them, right? So here you just have to write down like these. This is the approximately, you can see 60 words, like 1 2 3, like if you just count it off, it like 50 to 60 words you have to written. Now you just have to write down what? You just have to write down the uniqueness. So when it is asking for you to write down the uniqueness, you can use the simple comparative format to write down the uniqueness, right? Comparative format to write down the uniqueness. And how is that comparative format used, by the way? You can simply put it down like the tribal knowledge, okay, tribal knowledge on that side, and on the other side you can write down the the conventional knowledge. All right, on the side of tribal knowledge you can write down that first of all, the first thing that it is verbal and transmitted. Second, dynamic in the nature. That means it keeps changing with generation to generation, like some generations they know more, some generations they know less. Okay, dynamic in the nature, verbal and transmitted in the nature. That keeps you can say lost to great extent. Apart from writing this line, lost to great extent, you can simply write down that endemic in nature, okay, verbal in nature, transmitted in nature, dynamic in nature, endemic in nature, okay, endemic in nature, sustainable in application, right? Or in fact, writing this point, you can write down the applicability is higher, or you can say practically sustainable. These kind of things you can write down. And also purely experimental rather than theoretical. Okay, so exactly opposite of this will be the conventional knowledge that is recorded, okay, that is transmitted through the interpretations and analysis, and that is somehow static if it is not when not going into any research. Okay, it also includes the similar thing like experiment and methodology examinations, but that is done with the sophisticated tools and instruments. In the tribal knowledge, you just do it with your assumption, with your understanding of the context, that is all. So this is how you have to write it down. But please keep on using the examples. Like you have to use the example. A lot of examples are there. For example, you can use the expertise of the Nilgiri and the Western Ghat tribes in the conservation of the vultures. Okay, and for example, the expertise of the Western Ghats and the other tribes in the conservation of the grasses, certain grasslands. Okay, not just that. Let me tell you that even there are various tribes, for example, named as Soliga tribes. Okay, Soliga tribes. So that, you know what, actually what happened, that the tribes, some of them keep performing certain cultural or traditional activities, like burning the forest of certain area, burning the certain type of grasses, actually without considering these tribal practices into the mind. If we simply prohibit all the activities of tribals in the forest, it was done. It is a practical example. It was done. So what was the result? The undesirable grasses and undesirable fauna, okay, undesirable grasses and undesirable flora and fauna actually took over that specific area of the Western Ghats, and it resulted into the loss of the precious species which were endemic to the Western Ghats. And it was found later that the tribes, right, the Soliga tribes, they actually used to burn only those areas specifically where those undesirable grasses used to grow. Okay, so that is how actually you can write down that it is advisable that we must take the advice and cooperation of the native tribes which are living there since thousands of years in the maintenance of the any protection or any conservation related drives. That is where their knowledge is much more unique and applied and sustainable as compared to the mainstream knowledge and cultural systems. Okay, I have given much more tilt towards the conservatives opinion, like in the environment and all. You can also write down your own way if you are having any exceptional understanding of the culture, right? Because nowadays cultural systems are slowly getting extinct day by day, right? Next question was that, to what extent did the role of the moderates prepare a base for the wider freedom movement? Comment. Guys, this is a very simple question, very simple question. It is asking you the question to answer this in the 250 words. So that is a very convenient way to write down. To what extent did the role of moderates prepare a base for the wider freedom movement? So here it is asking you to comment, means introduce. I will not write down the answer for this question because that is something very common. Everybody can write down by their own self. I'm just going to give you the structure. Okay, so introduce who were moderates and what were their policies, right? What were their policies? Okay, then usually just because it is to comment, so just give a hint of their negatives, that means their uninfluential strategies. A hint of, that means not more than 2-4 lines, that is all. Hint of their uninfluential strategies. But then what you have to do, then focus on their positive aspects, right? Positive aspects, that is all. That is where the actual answer, like in the first you can say it is 250 words, so just use the 50 words to 60 words to give the overall introduction and the negatives and all. Use the language properly and then put down the heading. What should be the heading? The heading should be their role as the foundation. So guys, whenever I teach to the students, I usually give them an opinion based critique of the role of the moderate. So I just put them on the scale and I put it like the moderates as the failure and the moderates as the foundation, right? So in my classes, like, you will be getting this one. However, you just have to mention moderates as the foundation, that's all. Okay, so what were the things that made them the foundation? That is, they were the earliest generation of Indians, right? Indian nationalists. When I am saying Indian, so I am putting it in inverted comma also. So there is a chance of explanation, and you will need this chance of explanation. That is why I am writing it in the coded form. Okay, quoted form. Sorry. Earliest generation of Indian nationalists. Then they provided a deeper understanding of the nature of British state. Now this was something very essential. Otherwise, if the British state was understood, half of the job was done. So they provided a deeper understanding of the nature of British state by closely working with them. Okay, and the third thing that they did as a foundation, that they prepared the next generation of leadership. And guys, it is always very easy to just blame your previous generations that they did nothing, but had they not done anything, you won't have standing here. Okay, so prepared the next generation of the leadership. Got it? Then again as a foundation, what was they dealt the timely and appropriate, dealt the issues timely and appropriately. Like, whatever was the best possible strategy at that time, they adopted that strategy only, because they were, and then again you can write down positive point, that they provided path breaking and evidential critique of the British state. Okay, then you can write down the foundation part. They exposed the economically exploitative character of British rule. So they actually busted the myth that British were ruling for the good of India. They actually provided, you can write down the example of the Ramesh Chandra Datta, Dada Bhai Nauroji, okay, and you can write down the Subramaniam Bharati and all, okay, not Subramaniam Bharati, but you can simply write down the what was that name of the Maharashtrian leader, M.G. Ranade. So they actually provided the great work and details related to the economic understanding of the British state, and they proved very cleverly that, evidentially in fact, that British were actually looting the Indian wealth, right? Poverty and British rule, Dadabhai Nauroji. Economic history of India, Ramesh Chandra Datta and M.G. Ranade. What did he write? An essay on the Indian economy, right? So this is what you have to write down. This is what you have to put an approach. And last but not the least, they were not the romantic young nationalists, right? They were not the romantic young nationalists, but matured and practical leaders who first introduced the nationalism rather than romanticizing it, right? This means that they simply did not romanticize the nationalism that we will die for the nation. Guys, if you die for the nation, then you cannot actually carry your nation where you want to carry it. Right now, you have to stay alive, you have to face the issues, face the troubles, remain practical, and then you have to do something for your nation. That was what their approach was, and that is how they actually acted as a foundation of the national movement. Then bring out the constructive programs of Mahatma Gandhi during the non-cooperation movement and civil disobedience movement. Guys, here you just have to introduce the strategy of struggle. Okay, struggle, truce, struggle. What is this struggle, truce and struggle? Basically, struggle, that was the period of movement, and truce was the period of social reconstruction. Right, social reconstruction. So I will just give you the hints because it is related to Gandhiji, and you can have sufficient substance to write down the answer. So just use his anti-untouchability movement, okay, as the major crux of it. Anti-untouchability movement. Then Charkha, that is the spinning wheel. Charkha and Khadi movement. Then Swadeshi, then Gram Swaraj, then use of the locally fared services, not just goods, Swadeshi, but services also. And last but not the least, the concept of trusteeship. These are the points, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 points are there. So you have to actually mention the details of these points and just elaborate these points, and that will be very much clear, crystal clear, because it is a direct question. It is a very, very direct question in the nature. Now, next question. There arose a serious challenge to the democratic state system between the two world wars. Evaluate the statement. Now guys, this is something very unique and very wonderful question. You just have to say that it was a good question asked this time, okay, because the world history part was often ignored by the students and the teachers like me, when who actually used to teach the world history in every class. So the students did not take much interest, but this time they were actually trumped by the UPSC. How to approach this question? Introduction, body and conclusion. This is a proper formation for this particular question. How to do that? Serious challenge to the democratic state system between the two world wars. Guys, the time period is 1918. You can write down 1919 up to 1939. This 20 years duration. And serious challenge to the democratic state system. What is it asking for? Guys, nothing else. It is simply asking for the imperial Japan, okay, and expansionist policy, right? Expansionist policies, right? It is asking for the rise and strengthening of Nazi Germany, all right, and it is asking for the rise in popularity and power of Mussolini, right? Mussolini in Italy, right? In Italy. Actually, let me tell you that these all, even though Japan was an imperialist power, but still it had the elements of the elected, right, democratically elected diet. So it had the elements of democracy, right? Not just that, even the Germany, the government of Hitler was also, right, also it was also democratically elected, right? and Mussolini was also supremely powerful, democratically elected, right, leader, right. All these conditions actually led to the common thing, the emergence of, right, the emergence of autocracy, right, autocracy from the democracy, or in fact say nowadays it is called as the anocracy, right. Anocracy is the word that is used most often. It is a new word, in fact, that actually showcases that the democratic setup is there, but the ruler behaves as the autocrat or the dictator of the entire system, right. Now, so what should be your approach in this particular question? So guys, you just have to write down an introduction. How will you write down the introduction? That post the Treaty of Vienna, Severus, and, right, Vienna and Severus and Tumult, what happened? Post the treaties of the World War One, right? Now, there started a system of the established democracies converting into the popular dictatorships and later into the autocratic states, and this phenomenon was commonly observed in the nations which were affected the most after the First World War, either being on the losing side or being ignored despite being on the winning side. So Germany actually was the country that lost the First World War, and Japan and Italy, though they were the part of the the winning side, but still they were totally ignored while the distribution of the profits was done after the First World War. So therefore what happened? The reigning governments, right, the incumbent governments were considered as the weak governments, and highly supported and highly popular democratically elected governments replaced the previous governments. Like in the Germany, the Weimar constitution that was actually implemented, it was thrown out by the Nazi government, and in Italy also Mussolini replaced the earlier ruler, and that is how he became the most powerful ruler in the state. Now this is what you have to keep your approach, and simply mention these three and give the details, and that will be enough. Consider it as the 5 marks for each, and like you have to give approximately 75 to 80 words each. That's all. 75 to 80 words means what? Each have to be written with 3 features. That's all. See guys, when you actually divide your answers into the sub points, that is how the answer become very easy to attempt. Otherwise it looks very troublesome. Okay, but you just see the approach. 3 different points are there. Break these 3 for each of them 3 sub points. Approach it and put it just 75 words in each of them. 25, 25, 25 in each. And guys, you do not actually have to count the word. You just count the keep a rough idea in your mind, so that when that is actually going to develop once you are going to practice your answer writing sessions. Okay, now discuss the multi-dimensional implications of the uneven distribution of the mineral oil in the world. Guys, this is actually the question that I have hijacked, and this question should have been under the part of the, you can say, current affairs, or the, you can say, historical, international relation related, political, several dimensions are there. So multi-dimensional implications of the uneven distribution of mineral oil in the world. Guys, I will just give you the points, and this will create a tremendous answer. Okay, first of all, that you have to write down how many implications are there. Write down the political implications, right? Write down the political, and you can say again, diplomatic implications are there. Diplomatic implications are there. You can also write down the economic implications are there. Okay, then regional regional and cultural implications are there. All right, regional and cultural implications are there, and futuristic implications. Now, in each of these, what points are you have to mention? Political implications, that means those countries which have the higher reserves of the oil, right, they had a stronger political favor from the superpowers, and they always actually tried to keep the mineral oil rich countries into their own domain. You can give the example of the Saudi Arabia, and that was actually kept into the good books of USA, despite that USA proclaims itself to be a champion of the democracy all over the world. But in its closest ally, Saudi Arabia, there was no hint of any democracy till the very recent crown prince, right, Mohammed bin Salman actually came to the power. And in fact, even he also got one of the Kamal Khashoggi, right, Khashoggi actually got killed him, that Turkish journalist. Still America did not actually dare to touch Saudi Arabia in any way. That shows that how powerful political positions the countries which are oil rich they enjoy, right? You can actually also put it down in the diplomatic one, right? At the same time, do not forget that the political turmoils also take place. Political turmoils or the political troubles also take place, mostly in those countries which are oil rich. Do not forget the Kuwait, do not forget the Iraq or Iran, okay, or the Venezuela, right, Venezuela. So Venezuela crisis, okay, owing to the oil, because of that Venezuela was highly interfered by the communists as well as the American governments, and that led to the complete uprooting and destruction of the local systems over there, because of which Venezuela is in a very pathetic condition right now. Nigeria, China is highly interested in Nigeria nowadays, and Nigeria that once used to be the largest economy of Africa is now going into the tatters. Okay, then Kuwait and Iraq dispute, and America and Iraq dispute. So Kuwait and Iraq dispute was actually regional, but America actually made it international type of dispute, because owing to the great oil market, as Kuwait was a very minute, little bit progressive on the side and highly rich in the oil and natural gas. That's why America wanted it to remain on the side of the capitalist bloc, and Iraq, that was closer to the USSR side and under the leadership of Saddam Hussein. So once the USSR fell, right, in 1991, so there Saddam Hussein actually was challenged first in 1991 only, the Gulf War. Okay, the Gulf War, and then finally he was totally scrapped in the 2003. That was the time under George Bush, right, when America attacked Iraq. All that political trouble took place because of what? Because of the oil. Diplomatic presence is also there, because those countries with the greater presence of the oil and as well as the political support, they have much better diplomatic assist or diplomatic say. For example, whatever Saudi Arabia, if Saudi Arabia or Russia or the countries like Venezuela, in their respective regional areas, their opinions actually do matter. That is due to their diplomatic strength, right? Suppose if in the Organization of Islamic Countries, OIC, if Saudi Arabia goes against something, or that becomes a big issue. Okay, economic, obviously this is a big feature, big factor, okay, big implication of the oil, because several countries are there which do not have anything else apart from the oil, but they are super rich. UAE, Kuwait, all the Gulf countries are actually having the good standards of living, income, because of the oil. Okay, then regional and cultural implications are there, mainly due to the specifications of the distribution of oil. The several regions are richer in the oil, and there what happened? There the domination that naturally occurs in the behavior of these countries, and they actually consist themselves as the global powerhouse, or the source of global energy, something like that. So there is a slight cultural impact also, slight, not very much, but slight cultural impact also, right? And final, last but not the least, that is the futuristic implication, that nowadays most of the countries which are conventionally rich in the oil deposits, they are looking for switching their oil dependent economies to an alternative based economies, like Saudi Arabia, like UAE, like Kuwait. All these countries are doing, Russia, all these countries are doing. Why? Because we all know that fossil fuels are not the future. The future is of clean fuels, and these nations actually, unfortunately, they have the fossil fuels only. So whichever countries are now having the availability of both mineral oil as well as the fresh sources of energy, so these countries are now gaining much more significance among the oil blocks. Okay, so guys, this is how you have to approach the entire question. And not just that, in the beginning part you can like put it on the OPEC, but that is not very much required here. Got it? Last question that says, how does Indian society maintain continuity in the traditional social values? Enumerate the changes taking place in it. Now guys, this is the question that demands pure writing skills and nothing else. How Indian society maintain continuity in the traditional social values? How it maintains the traditional social values through through the system of families. System of families, particularly you can write on joint families, system of joint families, system of festivals, system of rituals and customs. Okay, system of seasonal celebrations. Okay, seasonal celebrations. Then specifications of the attires, cuisines, and the folk songs and dances. You can attire and cuisines on one point, and another point folk songs and dances. Now, got it? Isn't it very interesting? The system of joint families, there the elders in the family, they keep on passing the traditional social values to the younger ones, right? The stories told by the lullabies told by the grandmas and grandpas, the stories etc. told by the uncles and aunts. So those actually goes as a traditional transfer of the knowledge and traditional transfer of the social values, that we have to obey our parents, obey our elders, we have to touch the feet of the parents. These are the Indian society, Indian social values. We have to keep one chapati for the cows, we have to feed the stray dogs, we have to feed the crumbs to the sparrows and the pigeons. So these are the things passing on to us from system of the joint families, obviously. Then festivals. Our festivals are actually nothing but the cultural ambassadors, which occasionally but definitely they keep on transferring the social learnings. We are actually curious and aware about our traditional values only through the festivals, like the Satyamev Jayate, or always the truth prevails over the false, or the good prevail over the evil. The festival of Dashera, right? That let us lit the or enlighten the life of a poor. That is festival of Deepavali. Okay, giving the charity, the alms, colorful, mixing up of the society without any discrimination, holy. Okay, so these are transferred to the festivals. Rituals and customs. Certain rituals and customs are there. For example, no matter what happens, but a traditional type of marriage is always preferred by every single family in India. they actually, this is the legally accepted as well as culturally accepted way, that the saptapadis, the mantras, the feras and all those things. Not just that, the namkaran, right, the nomination ceremony, there are, the 16 sanskaras, not all are performed, but the vidyarambh, right, vidyarambh means the first writing or the first reading ceremony is there. So these things are actually fee. When there is the Basant Panchami type of ritual festival, there are certain rituals like the Saraswati Pujan, right, the worship of goddess Saraswati. How do we exactly know? The younger generation comes to know about these things through the customs and rituals whichever they observe around themselves. Then there are seasonal celebrations, like one is coming on the 14th of January, the Makar Sankranti, right? There are Magh Mela, Makar Sankranti, Lohri, So the people, sometimes the younger generation, they keep asking it that how does it happen? So the values, the traditional social values are actually transferred through such type of seasonal celebrations, that we must cherish the locally grown crops, locally or homely made sweets, right? The social value includes the habit of eating also. Social values include the cohabiting together, sitting together, okay, that is also. Social values also include the way of dressing, the way of eating, everything, and these are also a great carrier of the social values. And last but not the least, folk songs and dances. Okay, in Garba there are the Garba, the folk dance, okay, or the folk songs like the folk festivals like Chhat is there, okay, the folk songs like Birha is there, okay. So once when the person sings Alha Udal, Alha or Birha, or there are several other folk songs as well, Chaiti and Phag and so many things. So then the person comes to know, like suppose you guys are listening these terms, Chaiti, Phag, Birha, I don't think that many among you would be able to understand these terms without any reference. Once I have told you, okay, then you will go to refer it, to search for it, then this is how you are getting to know about it. So as an elder telling you about the folk song and dances, if you would have seen it, then also you would have searched it. I have told it to you, then also you are going to know it. So then it will be transferred as a social value from myself towards you. Okay, so that is how this answer, this is most beautiful question in fact in the entire paper, like a system of, you can simply write down the points. So 1, right, 2, 3, 4, okay, 5 and 6 points are there. Okay, 6 points are there, and the basic introduction and the conclusion, that should be right, that should be very much conventional, that India is a nation of culture and traditions. Here, not here, it is one of the oldest and continuing civilizations of the world, and which clearly owes to several factors of its society which keep on passing these social values to the upcoming generations. This is how you have to write down the introduction. Okay, these are the following are the methods or the ways to transfer the values, and there you have to write down these 6 points, and finally you will conclude it by writing down that therefore or thus it is evidently clear, because in the conclusion you do not get much aspect. Thus it is evidently clear that in order to continue the cultural specification of any nation or any society, it is always essential that there should be or there must be the element of permanency and element of the enjoyment in the traditional and customary traditions and customary rituals of the society, which is maintained in India, and therefore India is able to evolve without losing its social identification. Okay, without losing its social identity. Okay, so this is how you have to cover up the questions. So guys, I hope that it was helpful for all of you, and if it was helpful, so I hope that obviously you are going to attempt all these questions beautifully, and if you have attempted it already in the mains, so I think that this should have been your approach as well, and I wish you all the best for the mains examination, right? If you have attempted it, so for the results, and if you have not attempted it, so for the upcoming examination. Thank you so much guys, take care and have a great day. Thanks a lot.
Hello students, welcome to Legacy IAS Academy. Today we are going to discuss about the recently held UPSC mains examination, and in this we are going to discuss about the geography section which was asked in General Studies 1. Total 11-12 questions are there. So we're going to discuss that what should be our approach in handling the questions. We are also going to discuss that whether some questions have been asked from previous years or not, and we are going to discuss that how we can use the maps and diagrams to make our geography answers more better, so that you can fetch more marks in the mains examination. So let us try and discuss each of the questions one by one. So first of all, the first question that was asked from geography section was regarding 10 mark. In generally you have in UPSC you have two types of questions are there. One questions are 10 marks, other 10 questions are actually of 10 marks, and remaining 10 questions are of 15 marks. For 10 mark questions you have to write within 150 words. So the first question is regarding that differentiate the causes of landslides in the Himalayan region and the Western Ghats. So it is very straightforward direct questions, and the similar kind of questions has also been asked in year 2017 mains examination, where we have to compare that what are the reasons behind the landslides in both Western Ghat and Himalayas, and this time the similar question are there, just instead of comparison they asked to differentiate the causes in the landslide between both regions of Western Ghats and Himalayas. So first of all, if we talk about what should be our approach in answering this question, so as we are talking about landslide is a kind of geographical term, scientific term. So in this kind of question, best way that you can start is with answering with defining what does the actual term landslide means. Then further, once you define this topic, second you can go and try to denote on the map of India that what is the location of Western Ghat and what is the location of Himalayas. Actually you should try to incorporate at least one map or diagram for every 10 mark question, and at least 2 to 3 map or diagram for every 15 mark questions in geography. That should be your minimum to fetch more marks in geography section. Second, once you shown on the map Western Ghats and Himalayas location, then third you can go and discuss about the main body part, that is you have to differentiate the causes of landslide in Himalayas and Western Ghat and how it varies, and in last you can conclude with a way forward that how we can minimize the impact of landslide, or how we can take certain preemptive actions that can decrease the chances of landslide in these regions. So basically your answer should have revolved around these points. Once you draw, like for example you draw the map of India, and here you know that Western Ghat is located on the western coast of India, so this will be your Western Ghat, and Himalayas will be somewhere around this region. This is your Himalayas. So now we have to understand or explain that what is the main causes of landslide in Himalayas and how it different from the Western Ghats. So obviously the main cause of landslide in Himalayas is, you can explain the concept of plate tectonics. And briefly if I try to explain you, that we know that Indian plate was a part of Gondwana land. After that it has started moving toward north and it collided with the Eurasian landmass. And even as of now, Indian continental plate is moving toward Eurasian continental plate at the rate of 5 centimeter every year, and it is due to this plate tectonic movement, or it is due to this continental convergence. As you know, the concept is then plate tectonics. It causes instability in the Himalayas, it causes lot of earthquake in the Himalayas, and that triggers the landslide in the Himalayan mountains. And the second reason is related to that. We have a concept called as isostatic equilibrium, or the concept of isostasy, and it is due to this plate tectonic movement Himalaya has not been able to attain the equilibrium, and that is why it is more prone to earthquakes, more prone to landslides. The third topic is as we know that Himalayas are the largest source of glacier outside of Arctic and Antarctic region, and there is a lot of incidences of GLOF. GLOF stands for Glacial Lake Outburst Flow, where sometimes what happens, due to the increase in the amount of snowfall or increase in the amount of rainfall, the amount of water that is present in the glacial lakes in Himalayas, sometimes they outburst. That means they start to overspill, and once these waters start to go downside on the downslope of Himalayas, it also causes or triggers the landslides. So these are the main three reasons of landslides in the Himalayas. Apart from some anthropogenic reasons like construction of dams or construction of infrastructure, obviously these are common. While if we talk about Western Ghat, if you look at the location of Western Ghat, these are relatively on the most stable part of India, that is lying in the peninsular part of India, and that is why plate tectonic does not affect or play a very important role in causing landslides in these regions. So the most important reason of landslide in Western Ghat can be attributed to a heavy rainfall that is generally associated with the monsoonal rainfall of India. It is this heavy rainfall that causes a massive landslides due to, and this problem is exacerbated by the anthropogenic causes. That is, we know that we have construction of a lot of roadways, railways, we have this lot of mining is done in the Western Ghat areas, we also have dam construction for hydroelectricity purposes. So all these actually destabilizes the slope of the Western Ghat. Not only that, even when you construct roadways and railways, you actually remove or excavate large volume of materials from the Western Ghat, and they are collected, or they are like, we can say they are left around somewhere near the roads and railways. And due to this, what happens, whenever there is a little disturbance, whenever there is very massive rainfall, all these debris start to flow down along with the rocks and all these different kind of structures, and that causes massive destruction and damages in the downslope region of Western Ghat. So basically these are the main differences. Again, in brief, the plate tectonics can be said to be the mainly responsible for landslides in the Himalayas, while the massive rainfall can be said to be the main agent responsible for causing landslides in the Western Ghat. After that, you can conclude what are the ways which Government of India had adopted, or what can we do to decrease the chances of landslide in Himalayas. So that should have been your answer. Furthermore, coming to the second question that is related to the economic geography, is again a 10-mark question that you have to write within 150 words. And here actually you have to examine the role of gig economy and how gig economy can empower the women in India. So the definite or standard approach of your answer should be, first of all, you have to define what is a gig, then you can define what is or explain what is a gig economy, then you can discuss that what is the importance of gig economy in increasing the employment of women, and as women become more and more employed, their socio-economic status rises, and as their socio-economic status rises, we can say women become finally empowered in India, and finally you can conclude with the limitations. So obviously, if you try to look at broadly, what should be your answer look like? So first of all, you define gig. Gig is nothing but a part-time or contractual kind of job or contractual kind of employment, which is not a permanent employment. And gig economy is that economy which is dependent on casualized labor force, where very people take certain contracts, complete that contract, move on to some other employer, do their contract, do their work, then move on to some other employer. So employee keep on moving from one place to another place. Employer keeps on hiring new and different employees depending on their demands. And this gig economy is very common in advanced countries like US, Europe, where almost it is believed that 30% of the workers are gig employees. And if you compare that with India, in India still gig employees in a stage of we can say in very beginning stage, very nascent stage, and has a very high potential to grow. Now coming to the main demand of question, that what is the impact of gig economy on women's empowerment. So first of all, gig economy causes increased employability of the women. And why we are talking about why we have more employability of women in the gig economy? Because it provides facility to work from home. Now obviously, if women are given facility to work from home, a lot of their challenges, because we know that India, we have a patriarchal society. So the main challenge that women in India have to face is the women, especially after marriage, family are not very supportive of women if she wants to go out and work, because they want the woman to take care of family, take care of children, take care of the daily household chores and all these things. So if they have facility of work from home, then obviously she will not have to go out, and then in patriarchal society women have more chances to get employability. Obviously, then they will have more choices, because gig economy, as we discussed, the employee have chances to look at different employers, and depending on her or his needs and this pay or the wages, he can choose any of this employer. So we have more choices. Third, it gives flexibility and diversity to the worker, again because of choices. Fourth, especially with respect to women, they have less chance of sexual harassment, especially at workplace we talk about. Since most of the gig economy is based on work from home, less chance of sexual harassment causes more women to participate in this kind of economy. And last is the security point of view, especially if we talk about the what we talk about the Indian scenario. If women have to work for go to office or especially work in night, then there can be issues of security and safety, and that is why the impact on women is a kind of positive as far as the economy is concerned. And however, in conclusion, you can put certain limitations are there. What can be limitations? Obviously, gig economy, the pay will not be so good as compared to your we can say the normal job. Also stability, job security, all these things are there that are not very appealing to large section of society. So these are some limitations. That is how you should structure your answers. That is about the second question. Now moving on to the third question, that is question number 5. Again, it is a 10-mark question, so you have to answer within 150 words. The question is very straightforward. That is, despite India being one of the countries of the Gondwana land, its mining industry contributes much less to its GDP in percentage, they discuss. So what should be your approach? First, you have to show on the map that what is Gondwana land, how India was part of Gondwana land, and how it is as of now it is not a part of Gondwana land. Second, you have to prove this statement that contribution of mining in India GDP is very, very less, and by data you can try to prove your point. And third, you have to discuss about the main body of the question, that is what are the reasons why mining's contribution to GDP is very, very less. So obviously, if you talk about Gondwana land actually was an ancient landmass which was made up of different continents, like we had Africa, we had South America, we had Antarctica, then we had Australia, India, and Arabian Peninsula. So all these constituted a landmass that we know as Gondwana land. After somewhere around 150 million years ago, Gondwana land is splitted. India separated from Gondwana land and moved toward the northern direction, where it collided with the Eurasian continental landmass. That is how you can try to draw a map of India. Further, main body of the question should be that why India's GDP. First of all, you try to prove our point that you talk about the contribution of mining industry in the GDP of India. It is just about 1.54%. Is very, very low as compared to South Africa, where GDP contribution of mining is 7.5%. In Australia, which is part of Gondwana land, mining contribution is 6.9%, as per the data given by the Federation of Indian Mineral Industries. The reason why this is so is, first of all, we have low per unit expenditure on the exploration. If you compare the expenditure, governmental expenditure or the budget expenditure on the mining of India, it is very, very low. For example, Indian expenditure is only $17 per kilometer square as compared to Australia, where they spend $246 per kilometer square, Canada $192 per kilometer square, China $67 per kilometer square, and similarly Brazil, which is part of South America, $51 per kilometer square. So due to low per unit expenditure on exploration, it causes low rate of development of total OGP area. OGP means observed ground potential, how much potential India has in terms of mines. This whole potential is not able to be expressed or is not able to excavated because of low capital deployment. Next is, as per the FIMI report, Indian expenditure on exploration during these 3 consecutive years has been very, very less. The data, as you can look from here. Next is, Indian Bureau of Mines and Commerce Ministry has also shown that country's dependency on import is much more higher. Despite India having very good reserve, very high amount of mineral reserve, India is much more dependent on import, and that is something also causes a challenge or presents a kind of, we can say, stagnancy in the exploration of minerals in the India. Next is, low contribution to GDP is a direct fallout of India's inability to leverage greater exploration of its OGP. Of the OGP area, again these data are given that out of total OGP area of 0.57 million square kilometers, only about 17.4% of India's land masses has mineral reserve, but only 1.74% of country's land mass is currently being explored. Apart from that, other challenges are there. There is in India we have unique challenges related to land acquisition and executing resettlement and rehabilitation. We have examples of POSCO, that South Korean Mineral Agency, Vedanta is there. They always face problem in we can say acquisition of land for exploration of mineral, because tribal people are living and residing in the mineral region. Other peoples are also there that are residing in these areas. So that is the other problem. Second problem is of security challenges. Like Naxal activity is very, very common and very intense in mineral related areas like Bastar region of Chhattisgarh, Dantewara region of Chhattisgarh, Maharashtra, Madhya Pradesh, these Chota Nagpur regions of Jharkhand and all these areas. Third is lack of advanced technology, that also presents challenges in India. For example, we take example of Jharia. In Jharia actually, if India has technology, underground mining technology, a large amount of Jharia mines can be excavated, but still now large area of Jharia is lying underground and is lying unused because India does not have technology to mine underground. Then apart from that, different interpretation of laws by state and central government, leading to inadequate communication, that leaded to a lot of litigation, and that it take a lot of time for any mining company to actually, after defining that which mining area they want to explore, it takes a lot of time to actually start exploration, because litigation starts, the matter went to court, matter goes to court, the court takes a lot of time to settle all the dispute. So these are some of the challenges that India faces, and due to these challenges, India's mining does not contribute to as much as we see in the cases of other Gondwana land or early pre-Gondwana land countries that were actually part of Gondwana land. And that is why we can see here again from this slide that opportunity they are there to tap at different stages of mining, like geoscience, exploration, development, production, reclamation. At every stage there are certain deficiencies that India has to face, and if we are able to overcome these deficiencies, we can definitely increase our contribution of mining industry in the GDP. And in conclusion, you can try to relate that government programs, recent program that government has launched, especially Make in India program, Skill India program, all these programs cannot be successful unless and until we are able to exploit or explore our mineral resources. So that is all about this particular question. The next question is again of 10 marks. That means you have to write within 150 words. A direct question regarding to the water bodies and the reclamation of water bodies, especially in the urban areas, and what are the environmental application of such reclamations. So first approach should be we should try to explain what is land reclamation or what is water body reclamation. So basically water body reclamation means when any water body are there, we try to use this water body for any other purposes, either for construction of houses, construction of buildings, or construction, or we can say for discharge or disposal of wastes as a landfill. So anyway, when we are trying to use a water body for any other economic purposes or any other human purposes, then that is called as reclamation. Then you can give example from urban India with a map, that which are such areas where we are where we have done the reclamation of water bodies, and then we can discuss the environmental implication further with the conclusion. So now the answer should constitute of this part. First you will define what urban water body reclamation. The impact, environmental impact especially, is the first of all urban flooding that we see in the case of Mithi River. Okay, that is in Mumbai. Similarly, urban flooding that has happened in Chennai, urban flooding that has happened in Srinagar. So these are certain recent time examples where the scientists or expert have proved that it is the reclamation of water bodies that have indirectly or directly contributed to urban flooding. Because if water bodies are present in cities, in case of excess rainfall, what will happen? These water bodies will act as a reservoir, will act as an absorbent, and will absorb the excess water. But if you are reclaiming the water bodies, when you are filling up the water bodies, now whole urban areas is prone to massive flooding, because there is no excess, there is no extra place for water to flow through. Similarly, it damages the ecology, because if you are using the water bodies for waste treatment or using water bodies for disposing this garbage and all this waste, then ecology will be damaged, and that is why you see it will threaten the biodiversity. And as you can see that a lot of lakes were there in India, especially in urban cities like Bangalore, Chennai, Hyderabad, which already used to be a breeding ground for a lot of different birds. Now the birds, you can say the number of birds in those areas are dwindling, number of these animals in those areas and those lakes are dwindling. Third, it also deteriorates the water quality, because if you are using the water bodies for discharging pollutant, gradually this pollutant will seep through the groundwater, and when you are using the groundwater for your own consumption, then you will use actually the polluted water. Then heat, iron, in fact this is very common, because if water bodies are present in, especially during summer time, these water bodies will absorb the sunlight, and then since they will absorb the sunlight, and they will actually cause a kind of wind movement that will happen, like similar as we kind of this land sea breeze kind of phenomena. A similar phenomena happens. Overall the environment, overall the atmospheric temperature of the city will decline. But in absence of water bodies, as you know that most of the cities, if you remove water bodies, are made up of generally concrete items are heavily being used, and these concrete items absorb more strongly the sunlight, and since they absorb more strongly the sunlight, obviously the atmospheric temperature will also rise. So the presence of water bodies produce a cooling effect which is not present in absence of them. So that is what is called as heat island effect. Second, changes in rainfall pattern. Obviously, if water bodies are present in the urban areas, they will act as a source of moisture, they will act as a source of water vapor, and since they act as a source of water vapor, what will happen? These water vapor in times of heating can go up, can cause formation of cloud and cause rainfall. But in absence of these water bodies, rainfall pattern will also be distributed. Urban areas can receive less amount of rainfall as compared to before, and overall it can also lead to long-term climate changes. The examples we can see that Hussain Sagar Lake in Telangana is there. Here we have see dwindling of bird population. We have Palikarnai Marsh is there, where disposal of toxic waste in these areas has lead to decline in the ecological health of these areas, decline in the bird population of these areas. Similarly, Chennai Sundarban Delta is there, where people are continuously engaged in economic benefit, and they are cutting down. Massive deforestation is going on that has led to reduction in the population of Royal Bengal tigers and other herbivorous animal. Similarly in Deepor Bill, Assam, Chilka Lake in Odisha, we are seeing degradation in the ecology, biodiversity and overall water quality due to urban land uses, reclamation of water bodies for urban land uses. Then conclusion you can write about, the government is now focusing on Jal Shakti Abhiyan to increase the availability of water, or also increase the amount of water availability in the lake areas, in the pond areas, and overall improving the quality of the water. So that should have been your overall ingredient of the answer. Further moving to the next question, that is again 10-mark question, is direct question regarding, you have to mention the global occurrences of volcanic eruptions, main volcanic eruptions that has happened in year 2021 and the impact on the regional environment. Now this is a very beautiful question where UPSC has tried to merge the static with the dynamic. The effect or impact of volcanic eruption is generally, we see it will be same everywhere, but we have to add the recent examples that has happened in last year. So approach of this answer should be, first you have to describe what is a volcanic eruption. Second, you can give examples of volcanic eruption that has happened in year 2021, and then third you can discuss what is the general impact. So first of all, definition of volcanic eruption will be simply nothing but when we have, due to magma activity that is going on below the earth's surface, when there is large amount of gases, water vapor, ash, clouds and different kind of pyroclastic materials emerges out from the earth's surface and come up upon the earth's surface, that is called as volcanic eruption. The major volcanic eruption that has happened in year 2021 is Mount Kilauea volcanic eruption that has happened in Hawaii region, that is in Pacific, Krakatoa volcano eruption that has happened in Indonesia, La Palma volcanic eruption that has happened in the region of Spain, Merapi, that is again volcanic eruption that has happened in Indonesia, and Pavlov volcanic eruption that has happened in the USA. So these are the 5 major volcanic eruptions. Now giving the example of this, you can try to discuss about the impact. The major impact will be obviously because of volcanic eruption, large scale displacement will happen. For example, in Merapi there is around 7,000 people have to be displaced. In case of a Spanish volcanic eruption, around 1,800 people were displaced. That is the most important impact. Second, it causes economic damages. Because the volcanic eruption will happen, what will happen? It will actually causes damages in terms of infrastructure, like a lot of buildings are there nearby. These buildings will be covered by the gas, covered by the ashes, and that is cannot be used. Similarly, the thick ash deposits of the volcanoes will also cause damages to the agriculture and the crops. Apart from that, these thin, small gases, particles, solid particles, soot particles, that are released by the volcanic eruption can also cause problems on the health, because it can cause a lot of cardiopulmonary diseases. Apart from that, it can also impact the climate or weather of the given area, because these ash clouds, they cover the entire atmosphere nearby the area of volcanic eruption, and as these clouds cover the entire area, the amount of sunlight will not be available here, and it also, because they will absorb the sunlight in the upper atmosphere, that will cause, we can say, that can contribute to some extent to the event of global warming. And not only that, because these gas particles, ash particles cover the entire atmosphere near the volcanic regions, what will happen? The area will not see any sunlight, area will not receive any kind of rainfall, and due to this, the overall ecological conditions of area will deteriorate. Second, also because these cover the whole entire atmosphere, it can also cause problems in transportation, especially air transportation, because visibility in the atmosphere will be very less due to this thick gas cloud and the ash particle. Not only that, it also impacts the process of soil formation, and it also impacts the river flow. We have seen the cases of Bebeng River. When the Mount Merapi erupted in Indonesia, the lava and all these things went up to Bebeng River and actually changed the ecology or changed the overall water quality of the Bebeng River. And not only that, even changed the direction of flow of the Bebeng River. So it also impacts the river flow. So these are some of the major impact of the volcanic eruption. In conclusion, you can write about what is the solution or what is the way forward, how we can try to minimize the impact of volcanic eruption. So for example, early warning systems and all these things we can put in place. Next question is regarding a simple straightforward question is regarding why is India considered a subcontinent? Elaborate on your answers. You have to write in the 150 word, that is 10 mark question is there. So first of all, your approach should be that you should try to define that what is the actual definition of subcontinent. Then you should try to explain that how the term Indian subcontinent originated, and third, why India is considered a subcontinent. So this should be three main dynamics or main ingredient of your question. Now, so first of all, here also, since you are talking about India, better you should draw the diagram of India and Indian subcontinent. So Indian subcontinent actually comprises of countries like India is there, then we have Bangladesh, we have Bhutan, we have Pakistan, we have Sri Lanka, and then we have Myanmar. So these countries are collectively generally referred as a part of Indian subcontinent. Second, if we have tried to define Indian subcontinent or a subcontinent term, so as per Oxford English Dictionary, subcontinent signifies a subdivision of continent which has a distinct geographical, political and cultural identity, and also large landmass somewhat smaller than a continent, right? So on basis of this, if we try to understand that whether Indian subcontinent fit into this definition, so definitely if we talk about why India is a subcontinent, so first reason is geological reasons. Indian subcontinent, when we talk about, we are talking about the whole Indian plate. As we have discussed before, Indian plate is a term that is used to define the whole geological landmass that as present day comprises the India, Bangladesh, Bhutan, Pakistan, Myanmar and Sri Lanka. And these were part of a Gondwana land, and these Indian plate has collectively moved toward Eurasian landmass, and after collision we have now different geographical entity, different countries that have formed. So definitely geologically Indian subcontinent is a geological or a single geological entity in terms of Indian plate. Geographically, it can also be defined as a subcontinent because it is Indian subcontinent is surrounded by very strong barrier. For example, in north it is surrounded by Himalayas. In the south, it is surrounded by the Indian Ocean. So that is why, despite it being colliding with the Eurasian landmass, it is a separate geographical entity because it is demarcated by Himalayan mountain ranges in the north, even Hindu Kush mountain ranges in the western side. We have Kirthar and Suleiman mountain ranges in the eastern side, and Indian Ocean in the southern side. So that is a separate geographical entity. That is why it can be called as a subcontinent. Politically, since the time of British or since even ancient times, since the time of Mughal invasion and all this Islamic invasion, whole Indian subcontinent, that is all the countries that we discussed before, were ruled by almost a single dynasty or ruled by a single empire. For example, Mughal Empire, or whether we have a British Empire, and that is why politically it has also been a part of Indian subcontinent. Culturally, we have a very distinct culture. For example, we have origin of Buddhism that has happened here. We have Islam that has propagated and we can say expanded in this area. We have Hinduism, a lot of culture of Hinduism is there. So culturally also these regions have been a part of a single whole. That is why it can be called a subcontinent. However, in present uses, since after the independence of India, these different countries have formed, and due to this Indian subcontinent, they do not want the term to be used because they feel that here we have a supremacy of India is being shown by using this term. So that is why in modern geopolitics, rather than using the term Indian subcontinent, the term that is being used is called as South Asia, and South Asia is also a distinct geopolitical entity. So that is how you can conclude that in present times, rather than using or emphasizing the Indian subcontinent as a term, they emphasize emphasis on the South Asia to ensure that the independence of each nations are characterized, or independence of each nation of Indian subcontinent are given due importance. So that should have been the ingredient of your answer, or basically an overview how your answer should have been look like. Then next, if we talk about is regarding a direct question that is asked from the physical geography, and that also geomorphology. It is a 15 mark questions that you have to write within 250 words. So here you have to briefly mention the alignment of major mountain ranges of the world and explain their impact on local weather conditions with an example. So obviously here you have to draw a map, you have to draw a world map and show the major mountain ranges, and then you have to discuss their impact on the local weather. So major mountain ranges will be obviously the mountains that you have to mention in this question is Rockies. You have to mention mountain like Andes, you have to mention mountain like Alps, then you will draw Himalayas, then you will draw Rockies, Andes, Alps, Himalayas. After that you can draw Atlas mountain, you can draw Scandinavian mountains, and then once you draw all these mountain ranges, show them the location on the map, then you can go further, move on and try to explain that how the impact of these mountain ranges you see on the regional weather. So first impact, lot of local winds are there. For example, we have Chinook winds in the Rockies. The impact of Chinook wind will discuss how it impacts the agriculture, how it causes the melting of snow, how it causes the opening of the grassland for grazing by the animals. Apart from that, you will also discuss about the Foehn wind, similar kind of wind that we see in the Alps region. Similarly, you can talk about the Jonda wind that we see on the leeward side of Andes mountain ranges. So a lot of local winds are there. Apart from there, in the Alps region, we have a lot of local winds in Mediterranean. For example, we have near this Sirocco winds are there. Then we have Mistral winds are there. Then we have Bora winds are there. So we have discussed about lot of local winds that emerges due to the presence of this mountain barrier. Then we talk about how rainfall happens. Then we talk about how, for example, if we talk about desert formation in the location or presence of Andes, Andes act as a climatic barrier, and due to presence of this climatic barrier, what happens? We have formation of a desert that we popularly known as a Patagonia desert. Similarly, due to presence of this Kunlun Shan mountain, the Chinese mountain Kunlun Shan, Tian Shan mountain, these also act as a climatic barrier and had lead to production of desert, development of desert that we call as a Gobi desert, as well as we have Takla Makan desert. That is the other impact. Similarly, on the great western Australian ranges, there are great dividing ranges there. Due to presence of these mountain ranges in Australia, we have development of Victorian desert. So that is what you will discuss. Next, impact on agriculture, obviously because mountain act as a barrier. So generally if we talk about the western Ghats of India, so what will happen? As you know that Western Ghat, on the windward side of Western Ghat will have heavy rainfall due to the orographic effect, and due to this here will have more agriculture, more availability of water, due to which agricultural activity will be more abundant. While on the leeward side, since water availability will be relatively less, what will happen? The agricultural activity will not be so much predominant due to the aridity of the land masses in this area. So that is how you can discuss. Similarly, when you talk about Himalayas, you have discussed how Himalayas plays a very important role in the monsoon, because if Himalayas were not present, the monsoon wind would have moved away from India, would have simply left India, and Indian landmass, especially the northern part of India, would have remained a very dry and arid regions. So due to this, Himalayas also act as a climatic barrier and does not allow monsoon wind to escape India. On the other side, in the winter time, Himalayas also protects India from the cold polar winds that is coming from Siberian region, coming from the polar regions, and thus maintain India a kind of, or give India a kind of tropical climate overall. So that is what we have to mention, the effect of the climate, effect of the mountain ranges on different climates. So it is a very easier question actually. If you have studied everything in details, then you would have got sufficient points to answer your question. The only thing that you have to focus here on, that you have to draw the world map, you have to show the important ranges, and then you have to talk about that how these mountain ranges have influence on the regional weather. Next question is regarding how does the melting of Arctic ice and glaciers of the Antarctic differently affect the weather patterns and human activities on the earth. That is what you have to explain. So again, on the map you will show the location of Arctic and Antarctic and tell about the common effect of melting, how the melting of ice in both Arctic and Antarctic affect the weather climate and other activities of the humans around the world, and then you can enumerate or discuss the different impact of Arctic and Antarctic melting. So the major points of this answer should have been the impact of glacial melt we see in the cases of climate and weather events. For example, as you know that as glacial ice melted, what happens? The sea level rises. As the sea level rises, what happens? More and more amount of water is available in the ocean, and due to this we have a very we can say a increase in the strength and intensity of the cyclonic activities. Especially if you look at the scientists, what they have said, that in last 2 to 3 decades we have more intense and more stronger and more even frequent tropical cyclones are occurring around the world. The main reason behind this can be said to be the impact of with the glacial melt that adds more and more moisture in the water in the sea of the world, and more moisture causes more generation of tropical cyclones. Second, we know that sea level rises. As sea level rises due to glacial melt, especially the coastal areas or the island countries, their human settlement will be at risk. They will have to be face displacement. They will have to move to some other safe areas. And due to this, not only that, in coastal regions, even agriculture, industries, urbanization, all these things will be affected. On the positive side, as you can see, the melting of Arctic ice will open up polar routes, because earlier time, this Arctic region, if it is surrounded by ice from all the areas, the ships or the larger ships cannot navigate through these regions. But now, due to melting of glacier, what is happening? The ice is converting into water, and through this water, ships can easily ply through. So new routes, especially in polar regions, will open up, and with opening of these routes, there will be more chances for exploring minerals and oils that is trapped in the Arctic areas. So that is on the positive side. However, it can also lead to a global war or clashes for exploration of resources in these regions. So that is what the impact of geopolitics will also be seen. Apart from that, in the Antarctic, we see certain differences, that due to melting of ice in the Antarctic, you can see rainfall variations, because what is believed by expert, that as the Antarctic ice is melting, what will happen? The Antarctic circumpolar current will be affected, and as Antarctic circumpolar current is affected, what will happen? The intertropical convergence zones, it will shift more toward north. And as ITCZ shift more toward north, due to this, what will happen? There will more rainfall in northern hemisphere and less rainfall in the southern hemisphere. That is one major impact. Second, it will also cause change in the wind pattern as Antarctic ice sheet melts. Now, as of now, if you look at this is Antarctic, and the general trend of wind movement is from land towards sea. But in case of more and more melting of Antarctic ice happens, we will see change in wind pattern from the coastal regions toward the land areas, and this change in the wind pattern will actually affect the monsoon also, will affect the agricultural also, and will cause more and more rapid decline of ice sheets in the Antarctic area. So that is the major reason. Then you can conclude with giving a way forward that how we can check the melting of the ice sheet, or how we can exploit the opportunities that are provided to us by melting of both Antarctic and Arctic. Further, the next question is regarding the multi-dimensional implications of uneven distribution of mineral oil in the world. Mineral oil, mainly we are talking about the oil reserve, gas reserve, and all these things. So approach of your answer should be standard. So on the world map, major mineral oil rich region of the world, illustrate how the mineral oils are unevenly distributed in the world. Then you can discuss what is the impact, multi-dimensional impact, and then you can conclude the way forward. So if you look at the present map, you can see that 66% of the mineral oil are found in the Middle East region alone. 9% is located in the Central and South America. 7% is located in the European countries. 7% is in African countries. 5% in European countries. 5% is similarly located in the North America also, and remaining in the other part of the world, Asia and Oceania. So what is the impact of this uneven distribution? Impact is, we have geopolitical impact, where such distribution causes war. We have seen the cases of, especially in last 10, 20 years, 30 years, when United States and the allies have waged a lot of war, especially among the Middle Eastern countries, mainly to control the oil and mineral oil resources. Also, it is believed that if any country is oil-rich country, there is more chances of autocracy. That means democracy will be stifled. That means human right will be impacted in a negative way. As you see in the many Gulf monarchies, we have monopolization. That means if any country or a group of countries like Arabic countries, they are very rich in oil and mineral oil reserves, that means they have monopoly. That means they can control the price of oils, and once you control the price of oils, you can control the overall whole economy of the world. So they will have more presence and more monopoly over the global economy. Economic impact will be because of the lack of or uneven distribution of resources. Some countries are in trade surplus, some countries are in trade deficit. For example, India is in trade deficit because we have no oil or gas reserves. We have to depend on import. Second, it causes resource dependency, obviously, since this mineral oil is distributed in various small areas of the world. So other countries of the world are dependent on the resources for their own deployment, or resources for their own uses on this handful of countries. Third, it also causes cartelization, as you see in the cases of formation of OPEC, oil and petroleum exporting countries. These countries can actually increase or decrease their output or input, and in that way they can control the price of oil in the market. And by controlling the price of oil in the market, overall global economy can be controlled to a significant extent. On the other hand, the presence of these oil-rich areas in the Gulf countries or the Arabian countries, they provide a lot of employment opportunities, and due to this presence of these employment opportunities, what we see a large number of migration of large number of people, especially engineers, technicians. They are migrating to the Gulf countries for getting better job opportunities. On the other hand, it causes poverty, displacement, because industries start to develop there, so people have to displace. Lack of focus on human resources, especially if some countries are resource rich countries. That means just by selling oil or mineral oil or gas resources, they can get a very handsome amount of money for themselves, and using this handsome amount of money they can do spend this money on a lot of infrastructure development and all this kind of development. For example, we see the cases of Dubai. However, one deficiency that we see is then the countries are not so much focused on developing human resources, because they already have a surplus, trade surplus, they already have a balance surplus, budget surplus, and that is why the human resources development suffers. The economic, we can say, the development of intelligence quotient, IQ, or development of what we can say as innovativeness, that all things suffer due to this. Apart from that, environmental damages, obviously it also causes income inequality among different parts of the world. Resource regions have much more income as compared to resource deficit regions. So these are the major impact. Moving forward, the next question is regarding what are the main socio-economic implications arising out of development of IT industries in major cities of India. So as you know, the large number of cities in India, especially talk about Mumbai is there, Gurgaon is there, Gurugram. Now we have Hyderabad, Bangalore, Chennai. So all these cities in last 10-15 years have emerged as a major IT hub of India. So that is, in that context, question has been asked that what are the main socio-economic implications that we see arising out of development of such IT city in the urban region of India. So approach should be, first of all, show on map of India major IT industries. For example, you can draw simply a map of India. You show we have Chennai, we have Bangalore, we have Delhi, Gurugram region, we have Mumbai, we have Pune, we have Hyderabad. So these are the major IT hubs. Then discuss the impact and then conclude that what should be the way forward. So IT industries, first of all, also you can try to explain that what is the importance of IT industries in GDP of India. So it is continuously on the rise. So contribution of IT industry in India GDP is continuously on the rise. That means the urbanization and the IT development is happening at a very rapid scale. The answer that what is the socio-economic impact, we can explain the impact on population. Population demography is changing. Large number of youth population especially is migrating in the urban cities to getting a good job in the IT sector. That is changing the family, because now earlier family were joint family, now the family structure is changing into we can say nuclear family structure. The culture is changing because a lot of mixing is happening. People from different parts of India is coming to one city. It is giving a metropolitan culture, metropolitan vibe. Education is being impacted because more and more people are interested in imparting their words. Education in the IT sector, in computer sector, engineering sector. Employment, obviously earlier India's major large number of population were employed in manufacturing industries or we can say agriculture industries. Now these people, after gaining sufficient or skillful employment education, now they are migrating toward the IT industry. So the India is now seeing a knowledge based development of a knowledge based industries, knowledge based employment. Second, it also causes changes in income pattern, health, entertainment, real estate, economy, manifestation, social population. Population, for example, we see in take example of Bangalore, population since 1981 to 2001 has doubled and reached about 6 million simply because of this increase in the IT industries here. Age sex pyramid has changed. That is, more and more number of youth population are migrating to these urban cities, and the number of the older populations are declining. That is overall changing the age structure, age sex pyramid. Capital and buying power, family structure, same thing I will discuss, are different socio-economic disparities are there, that is also rising. Health, one thing you can add here is the increase of IT industry is not only positive, we are also seeing the impact on the health, especially of young population, where the non-communicable diseases are on the rise, especially lifestyle diseases are on the rise. The simple reason is that IT industries demand a very sedentary kind of lifestyle where people have to sit on the table and chair for long extensive period of time, and they do have to work with their eyes, work on the computer. So this is causing a lot of non-communicable diseases like heart related diseases, cardiac related diseases, lung related diseases, and all these kind of things. And this is overall also called as building syndrome, because people who work in IT sector spend most of their time in a building, inside the building. So that is why it causes a lot of health related issues too. So that is how you can conclude also that how this can be improved upon. That should be your overall structure of the answer. The next question, the last question of economic geography, is regarding the main objective of population education, and we have to point out the measures that can be achieved in India in this regard. So a standard approach would be, first of all, you should try to define what is population education. Then you can try to discuss about the main objective of the population education in India. Then you can discuss about the measures that has been taken by the government for population education, and last of you can conclude with the importance of population education in the modern day of India. So first of all, you can define population in detail, you can define education in detail. Then population education has been defined. by UNESCO in year 1971 as an educational program which provides for a study of the population situation in the family, community, nation and the global and the world, with the purpose of developing in the students rational and responsible attitude and behavior toward the situation. That should be your standard definition. If you remember it, well and good. Otherwise, by yourself also you understand the definition of population, you understand the definition of education, you can try to club it to give your own definition of that. That will also be okay. Objective as given by the UNESCO is same: educational programs designed to make learners understand the interrelationship among population situation, change, development and aspect and quality of human life. Apart from that, some major objectives are to develop an understanding of demographic concepts and demographic processes. Demographic concept means population change, the rate of population growth, total fertility rate, replacement level, right. Apart from that, processes like how migration happens, how population changes, what is age sex pyramid, what is the India's age sex pyramid, how does India's age sex pyramid changing, how we can reap the demographic dividend, the concept of demographic dividend. All these should be imparted in the population education. Apart from that, it also aims with the objective of developing among the younger generation understanding of the most important phenomena of the modern world, that is the rapid growth of population and the causes of such population growth. Because unless and until you do not understand the causes of population growth, you cannot take preventive measures to check the population growth. And unless and until you do not take preventive measures to check the population growth, you will have the resource crunch in the long end, and that resource crunch will cause overall economic issues everywhere. Then third, it also aims at developing the understanding of the influence of population trend on the various aspects of human life, how population affect the social life, cultural life, political life, as well as the economic life. And last, it also develop an understanding of the close interaction of population growth and the development process with particular reference to development programs, raising the standard of living of people. Apart from that, several other objectives are there that you can refer to understand, that you have to write. 4 or 5 objectives are more than enough. You can write about that. Last, we will talk about what are the ways to achieve the population objective are there. So first, there is a first 5-year plan that has been launched by Government of India. Second, Government of India also launched National Family Planning Program to educate the citizens of India regarding what methods or what steps they can take to restrict the family growth or restrict the population growth overall. Then up till 1976, from 1976, National Population Policy was envisaged. Then in year 1986, the population education was made part of National Education Policy, and here magnitude of demographic situation and all the concerns related to the causes and consequences of rapid population growth was discussed. Then Government of India also launched National Literacy Mission. Here also population education was made a very integral part, and the people were made aware, especially children were made aware that what should be our how education can play a very important role in controlling the growth of population. Apart from that, we have early childhood care and education, and its integration with the ICDS, that Integrated Child Development Services, is also one aspect of population education in India. And then we have last, a population education cell, especially to imparting population education, had been set up in the NCERTs of the India. So that is the way how government is trying to achieve the population education or objectives of the population education. Then you can conclude that what more can be done. So overall, this was the geography part of the GS paper this year. Questions were, if talk about 50-60% questions were very straightforward. In 30-40% questions, we have to add current affairs based aspect, a current affairs based perspective we have to bring into that. Overall questions was, we can say it is of moderate nature. If you have studied geography very well, if you have completed standard books like NCERTs, and if you are very well aware with the current affairs knowledge or current affairs development, especially with regard to economic geography, population geography and the climate part of this geography, then I think you could very well easily answer all the questions in a very good way. So also this year, the number of questions from geography asked are very high. 11-20 questions were asked, which was not the case in earlier years. So the importance of geography has been very much in this particular year. So that is all about this particular topic and the discussion of geography in General Studies 1. The remaining papers or remaining subjects will be covered up subsequently. Till then, take care. Thank you very much.